Screaming Committee was extremely accurate in bringing you a relevant and timely story in heat. I'm sorry to say. The last 16 days, 8 of the last 16 days, 100 million Americans have been under heat alert. And we feel it down here in Georgia, no doubt. We got the wildfires out west, floods in Kentucky, temperature records being set every day. So we thought we would turn our attention to how heat is impacting us in the metro area. And we put together a panel with 3 terrific experts. To get to all your questions, I'll be brief on all our intros so we can get right into the heat story. So first off, we have Rich Knaw, the CEO of the Atlanta Track Club, putting on the world's largest 10K. Come on up, Rich, please. And as you guys can imagine, he was just teaching me that the Atlanta Track Club has 100 years of experience about heat, and that it's gotten more and more intense, extreme, and the medical preparation and incidents have been rising. So we'll hear about that. Also as an analogy of what's going on in every field, whether it's construction, high school football, peach farmers, right? Heat is taking its toll. Mark Papier joins us. He's a principal meteorologist at AT&T after 20 years at the Weather Channel. So thanks for being here, Mark. He was educating me at lunch that, when you're in meteorology, easy for me to say, it's science, but also there's a lot of discussion in the circles today about climate justice and the climate impacts that are inequitable around the world. So he's doing a lot of work in that field. And finally, Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jelks is here, an assistant professor of environmental and health sciences at Spelman College. Thank you, Dr. Jelks. She's also the chair of the West Atlanta Watershed and co-director of the Urban Heat ATL. And I don't know if you're aware, but we have citizen scientists, student scientists, professional scientists all measuring all over our city the urban heat islands and how things can vary just a block or two, or I imagine even unit to unit. So she'll tell us about that. Okay, so excuse me while we begin. All right, well, I think we should start with a hyper-local example of extreme heat. Tell us, Rich, about the Peachtree Road Race this summer and what challenges you faced acutely this summer.
Well, thank you for the intro, and thank you for having me today. This year's Peachtree was not hugely different than our last 10 years, but confirmed a trend that we continue to see. And that is that our wet bulb temperature on the 4th of July continues to rise faster throughout the morning than it did when the Peachtree was founded. The Peachtree was founded in 1970. It's known as the world's largest 10K with 60,000 participants. Interesting fact, for the first almost decade, we started at 9:30 in the morning. Now we start at 7. And we have, in any given Peachtree year, this year included, roughly 300 medical contacts in our medical tents. So we know that those medical contacts are coming, and the vast majority are heat related. So our solution really is pre-planning, knowing that those heat related issues are coming. And what we're finding is that those heat-related issues become more and more severe every year.
So one lesson is planning, prevention, and adaptation, perhaps?
Yes, and having subject matter experts. So you referenced this. We have between 100 and 150 medically trained physicians, nurses, et cetera, who support the race each year. And if it were not for the decades and decades worth of experience, we would be overrun in Piedmont Park with heat-related issues. So we really become a great source of information for road races and marathons around the world who are dealing with heat-related issues for the first time, whereas we've understood it for 50 years here in Atlanta.
So one takeaway for me already is no matter what industry we're in, I think having heat plans is going to be imperative, even though we probably never imagined that in different fields that we're in. Our building has 22 air conditioning units, and my office, the air conditioning's broken right now. So, Dr. Jelks, tell us another example of like extreme heat impact in Atlanta that you're seeing and how it can vary.
Thanks for the question. When I think about extreme heat in Atlanta and how it can vary, the research that I'm conducting right now through Urban Heat ATL is showing us and demonstrating where temperatures are hotter. So there's some neighborhoods that don't have the same investments in parks and green space and trees as other communities have. There are a lot of communities that have a lot of asphalt and concrete, these heat trapping surfaces, and we're seeing that those areas are hotter than other areas. Through our research, and we're not finished, there's a lot more data collection that we need to do, and a lot that we need to do to analyze that data. But just, from a very, kind of preliminary perspective, it's as we expected. Those areas that don't have those investments, that don't have trees, that don't have parks and green space are the areas where it's hotter. And unfortunately, these are also some of the areas where you have some of the older housing stock, so houses aren't energy efficient. And so people, if they have working air conditionings, are being forced to run that air conditioning a lot more. And that is contributing to issues around finances and energy burden as well.
It's incredible. What's an example of a range you see if it's 90 degrees in one shady place?
Well, I guess we have started to see maybe some differences, 7 to 10 degrees difference between different locations. So that's pretty significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Mark, that's got to be something you think about on a more macro scale as well.
I mean, Atlanta since 1970 has just shy of 30 more 90-degree days now than when we did in 1970. Now, not every year is the same, right? The weather changes, there's ups, there's downs, there's weather patterns built within that. But that's a decent trend at this point, 1970 to now, and to have 30 more 90-degree or higher days, that's a significant number. And so we see the fingers of us forcing a change on what would be a natural variability as well. There's still winter, there's still summer, there's hot days, there's cold days, but if you're pushing that up along the way, eventually it adds up.
Tell us about projections for heat rising in the coming decades. Is it expected to be a slow pace, a fast pace, exponential or not?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, right? So if you're used to seeing the Intergovernmental climate change reports and the different projections for global temperature, there's different paths that we can choose to be on. There's the we don't change anything path and we keep emitting and everything's really bad path that goes up really fast. There's the technology saves us path. Somewhere we rise for a while and technology comes in and flattens it up. And there's the we shut everything off immediately path, which we're not on. But they have that, right? We study that as well. What I can say is that the projections from climate modeling, the impacts from that, where we fall on those different lines, have been moving faster than those projections would have led us to believe. So while we're just starting those lines, right? They go out 50, 100 years. We're at the beginning of that. We're, for each report that comes out, our dots are ahead of pace, which is not where you want to be if you're trying to limit heat. That the global temperatures and the extreme weather that comes with that are happening faster than the projections would have said they were.
So obviously we need to start talking about solutions here today. I want to really quickly though, did you have to, Rich, did you have to plan for how hot would it have to be to cancel the Peachtree Road Race? Do you have to go down those scenario plans?
We do a lot of modeling, and I referenced the wet bulb temperature that drives our decision making, but it's not a simple measurement. So we have a wet bulb at the start line, we have a wet bulb that sits out Piedmont Hospital, and we have a wet bulb that sits at Piedmont Park, and we run all those together. and look at what we're experiencing in medical tents and make decisions. The short answer to your question is the Peachtree is not going to be on January 1. It's always going to be on July 4th. But we're going to continue to need to make adjustments. So we're at 7 o'clock in the morning now. I could see a time where we are consistently starting at 6:30 or 6:15. We are unfortunately going to need to start to communicate to people who have pre-existing conditions, who cannot be out in extreme temperature, that Peachtree might not be for you. And that's unfortunate because Peachtree is all about getting healthier, getting fitter through aerobic fitness.
Exactly. So, Dr. Jelks, what would be an example of, you discover an urban heat island, an area that is really suffering. How do you see a system of solutions that can improve it?
Thank you for that. So when we think about solutions, I think there are things that are short-term, and then there are the longer-term solutions. We need to be responsive, to these, spikes in temperature. One thing that has happened, locally in a lot of different municipalities, lately has been the designation of cooling centers. So that's one kind of short-term, it's a reactive measure that needs to happen, but our planning needs to dictate that we know where our cooling centers will be, in those cases of extreme temperatures. So that's one thing. DeKalb County, I noticed, in addition to, opening maybe recreation centers, they opened up libraries as cooling centers. They made it free to go to the pools. So that sort of short-term planning needs to happen. There are some studies being conducted, now to look at, low-cost alternatives, maybe ways that we can have cooler surfaces using, paints and, using certain pigments and paints that might, cool roofs and things like that. So those are kind of these short-term measures. But on a longer-term perspective, we've got to, look at our actions. What's our energy footprint look like? What does our carbon footprint look like? Should we be addressing things in terms of energy efficiency in different households? Where should we be planting trees and making sure that there's vegetation and green space? So I think there are a range of alternatives that need to be pursued so that we can address the threats that we see happening currently, but the ones that we anticipate to happen in the future as well.
Fantastic. Now, a question that can cross people's minds at times is, what I'm going to do here, turning off this light switch, switching to an EV car, is going to be a drop in the bucket of the amount of pollution and emissions in other nations that we can't control. There's no global governing body about this. What would you say, Mark, to folks that might feel that it's futile or defeatist?
Yeah, it's a yes and problem. If you ever done any improv classes, you have to answer with the yes and. It is true that right now some of the newly industrializing nations are huge emitters, but if you look at the longer scale from our industrial revolution to now, and if you look at a GDP, per emission per GDP, the U.S. is still far and away the leader for what's already in the air, and so it's a bit of I would call it a bit of a distraction to try to say, oh well, China's emitting more now, so it's their problem. Well, what's being pumped out immediately right now is not what's caused the warming so far, and probably isn't what's going to cause the next several years of warming either. It's what's already happened. And so it's yes and. We have to fix what's already been done, and we can't ignore what's being put into the air now. It's both. The same way that you have to tackle methane if you want quick drops in the global temperature, but you can't ignore CO2, which has a longer impact on as a greenhouse gas, as a warming gas. You have to do both, and so I think it's important to hear what people are saying, like, oh, but what they're really saying is they're worried. They're worried that we're going to do all this work and green up our houses and green up our companies, and China or India or someone else is going to cancel all that hard work and all that money. And really, I think the answer to that is looking at some of the images that come out from these newly industrializing nations where, there are farmers tending a field, barely wearing clothes, right? It's like cloths that are very different from what you would expect farmers in the US to be wearing. And in the background are wind turbines. They're not starting with our old technology energy. They're starting with today's technology, and they will transition to a much greener energy much faster than we did. China might be the biggest emitter. They're also the biggest user of solar power. That line never seems to be tied to the news stories the same way. They're trying, they're doing it. There's a lot of people there, and it's a very important thing to globally put pressure on. There's going to be financial incentives, I think, to change over what energy use is coming out of those other industrialized nations, but it's also a disservice to say, well, we don't have to do anything here because they're emitting more than us now.
Thank you for the context. And what would any of the three of you suggest businesses in Atlanta do to impact their energy use or their planning around heat?
Well, I think that businesses can look for those alternatives that can, give us some yield in terms of decreasing, our carbon footprint, energy footprint, et cetera. There is an initiative called Drawdown Georgia, and if you go to their website, they have about 20 different sort of high impact actions that can be taken. So everything from, reducing energy use in buildings to doing things like, reducing food waste. That's something, a lot of businesses can do in terms of moving more toward composting and things like that. And so I think they have a list of alternatives that can be tailored toward, different sorts of industries and different businesses. And I think that it would be helpful if those industries, look into, what works for them. Based on their context, based on their operations, what are those tangible steps that can be taken to reduce the carbon and energy footprint? The city of Atlanta, for instance, is one of the city government, is one of the leaders in terms of they have a Better Buildings Challenge, which is focused on decreasing the use of energy. And so that's one of the things that Atlanta is serving, as a leader in and as a model. And different, companies can also look into what they can do to contribute to that as well.
Mark, what would you add?
Corporations can move the needle really quickly. They're big, right? If some of the biggest corporations take some of the biggest stances, you move a lot of that needle very quickly. Changing your household energy budget, or if you put up solar panels, or you decide to get an EV, it absolutely changes your energy budget, and that's crucial and important and absolutely needed because there's a lot of individual homes, but you need a lot of individual buy-in that way. Yeah. There's less huge corporations, but if they buy in a certain way, I work for AT&T now. I'm still relatively new there, so hopefully I'm not messing up any of the company line. But they've pledged to go carbon neutral by it's either 2030 or 2035, which is a big stance for a giant corporation like AT&T, for them to be able to say that that's possible. I think it's also, for companies, they have some extra incentives. Part of it is financial. Right? The stock market reporting is now mandating that CSR happens and that the carbon budget is analyzed the same way your other financials would be. If you don't do that, it's looked on from the financial industry as like, well, if you're missing that, what else are you missing? You might not be as responsible a business, and so we don't want to put our money there. And so that's pretty good incentive for companies to get going if the financial industry is leaving you behind. And on the consumer side, if you're a business that's consumer facing, that in many ways the consumers are dictating this already. The surveys are a little bit different from the actual spend, but in surveys still, customers are really ranking environmental causes and responsibility from our corporations really highly. So if the company is, however they look at it, if they're looking at it from a financial regulation standpoint, or a consumer standpoint, they're going to start moving in that direction anyway, because they have to, because those forces are already at play. And so again, I think the companies are the same way that the mayors of the cities moved us forward a little bit faster. Like when the U.S. dropped out of the Paris Climate Agreement, a lot of mayors around the country did not. And so Georgia in particular, we had we were ahead of goals if the Paris Agreement was still there, the mayors were already doing it, and corporations are already ahead of their goals because the consumers are already dictating that change happens.
Okay. Now, how would we get the questions from the audience? Thanks. And while you're bringing them up, so that's what we can do as business people. What would you say as a household level an individual could do that has the biggest impact? Top 3 things.
Do you want that, or should I? What do you
can
think?
start, and I'll add.
Top 3 for a household, things involving what we eat, so what we're putting in our mouth and what we're throwing away and where we're throwing it away. So composting, less meat products, things that have a big carbon budget to start, and then not wasting it in the first place, or in the after place. So the food waste and what we're eating. It's really interesting, globally, a lot of people think that food waste is a rich country's issue, right? We buy a bunch of stuff, we forget about it in the back of the fridge, and then we wind up throwing it away, and it turns into methane. It's all true, but poor countries get hit twice. They have almost the same food waste issue, but it's lost in the field. It's decomposing in the field. It never gets to the people that need it. They're poor. The farmers need that money, but there's no infrastructure to get it off the field and get it to the people that would buy it and eat it, and they need the food. So they're hit multiple times, and it winds up being almost the same food waste budget, whether it's lost in fridges or lost in fields. So what you're eating and where it goes when you don't eat it. Making a conscious choice about what energy you're using, whether you can, put solar panels on your house or pay up to community solar like Georgia Power offers, and many other local, you can buy into community solar even if you can't put solar on your actual building. And then the next biggest is probably how you get around. If you can switch to an electric vehicle and that vehicle is charged by those solar panels, or the energy mix of your area is good. Even without that, the electric cars are better long term, start to finish, including all the waste of batteries and all the other headlines that happens. The electric car is still better environmentally.
How is the power mix in Georgia for electric car?
It's okay and getting better quickly. Nuclear is going to come online much more so. We're seeing the fees on our Georgia Power bills. It's going to get there. So nuclear is a much lower carbon emitter, of course. There's a lot of solar. We have we're in the South. We have a lot of sunshine, and so there's a lot of community solar. But there's also a lack of incentives from the state. We filled up our quota for residential solar extremely fast because the need is there, the want is there. And if you're not familiar with it, it's about net metering. So basically, Georgia Power paying you the same amount that you would pay them if you have extra solar during the day, versus if it goes back to the grid, are they paying you the wholesale rate or the rate that you would be paying, like the pennies on the dollar rate, or what you would be paying them, the one-to-one? If it's more one-to-one over a month, that's called net metering. Georgia Power had a program. It filled up almost immediately. There isn't one. It's probably coming back. This is a lot of information all being thrown out at once, so sorry if I'm losing you. But it's a really important incentive to a household where solar panels are still really expensive. And without that help from Georgia Power and the state saying, no, we're going to pay one-to-one on that excess because we're using it, we're going to use it and sell to other people, without that, it becomes even harder to get those solar panels on your house. Long way to answer. Food, energy, and driving are the top 3 for a household.
Thank you. Did you want to jump in?
So one of the questions that was surfaced is we're seeing a lot of more explosive rain events. We've seen what's happened in Kentucky. I know there was flash flooding here in Atlanta over the weekend. So it seems somewhat, when you think about rising temperatures and climate, it seems somewhat counterintuitive, like, well, we're having more rain. But it is directly tied together. So can you kind of talk very briefly about what the science is about why we're having bigger rain dumps?
Sure.
Sounds like you're...
Yeah, I heard briefly. It's one of my skills. The warmer air, and this is way oversimplifying it, but warmer air holds more moisture. There's more evaporation in a warmer world. There's going to be more humidity and thus more source for that rain when it does rain. We also know that there will be more drought because it's also really hot and that evaporation's taking the soil moisture away. And so you can have both of those things at the same time. You can have both more drought and more flooding in a warming world. The days of the heaviest rainfall are increasing countrywide. In the US, in the southeast US, I believe it's now 27% more days with the heaviest rainfall, which is usually looked at as 3 inches or more in a single day, and that's happening more and more frequently. The 100-year flood, which is one of the worst names weather people have ever given anything because it doesn't mean what it says, is happening roughly every 10 years. Proof that 100-year flood means nothing if it's happening every 10 years. We're really bad at that. We're bad communicators. But yeah, it's raining more, and yet the droughts in the West are happening, and they're worse as well. And the fire seasons, because of those droughts, are happening faster as well. It's the bathtub analogy. You're putting all the moisture up into the air, and when it does rain, you're opening up the drain in that bathtub, and it pulls from the entire atmosphere around it and lands in that spot. It's not just the water that's right above where the thunderstorm is. It's a much bigger atmosphere connection than that. And so it pours in that spot, and the other side of the bathtub where that drain isn't open is still in drought because nothing's falling there.
So one of the most common questions I saw in the cards was for people who have a lot of questions, maybe have some skepticism, what are some trusted sources? Where is the best place to go for information so that you can learn more that's kind of been vetted, approved, stays kind of moderate to is an extreme on either side? Where can people go? And anybody on the panel can answer this question.
There are a few sources, but I think it's a challenging question because some of this is really difficult to communicate. I am involved with one effort in which we're trying to kind of get a common sort of lay person's analysis out, and that's the National Climate Assessment. It's something that's published every 4 or 5 years. And so we're working now, there are individual chapters that try to break down the scientific information. There are chapters that look at the impacts across different parts of the United States. They look at health issues, look at technology, the built environment, what's happening in cities, and how we can, implement solutions to some of these issues and challenges. And so there is an attempt there to develop some high-level key messages and to break things down in a way that, people can understand. You don't have to necessarily have a scientific background. So that's one. I know the IPCC helped me with that acronym.
Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Thank you. They just had a report that was released back in the fall, and they have fact sheets and things that are, again, I think pretty, relatively easy to understand that are helpful, and they cover a wide range of topics, and they really get to this issue of, if we do nothing, what will happen, and then here are some of the solutions, here are recommendations that can be implemented that will make a change.
They're very science heavy, both of those, right? The National Climate Assessment or the IPCC, they put out, assessments, and it's huge climate jargon and lots of stats and lots of pictures for, but the science is there, right? So if you want to get all the way into the weeds, those are great things to look at. They both have the summary for policymakers is the first thing in those giant books of paper. Much more approachable. It's kind of the Reader's Digest version of what those giant reports are saying. They're very helpful. And again, much more approachable and easier even for a non-scientist to get through. But let's say that even that is too science heavy. People, and this is admittedly coming from a very biased perspective, generally there's a lot of trust with the local meteorologist in any community. they are the scientists on TV. They will tell you when their forecast is right or wrong. So there's a trust that's built there. Climate Central is partnering with local meteorologists to do climate the same way that they would be doing weather reports as part of the news. It's a Climate Matters program, and you'll wind up with really good information through that. And then also, totally biased, the Weather Channel, where I was for a long time, has a side brand called Pattern, and it's exclusively climate solutions and climate science broken down into ways that people can understand. And so that can be found on your phone and TikTok and lots of other places. There's also a show, I think, called Pattern now that is using some of that on the Weather Channel. So I think finding your trusted sources, whether it's your local news, your NPR news, your relationships with local universities like UGA and Georgia Tech are both doing excellent work in the climate space, and through the scientific process, that information is vetted many times over before it makes it out to the public. And the National Weather Service and all of the branches that come from NOAA will have vetted information to look through.
Thank you. So I guess and this wasn't a question that came up on the card, but I think for all of our members out there who are doing anything outdoors, I was mowing my grass recently, and I did it in the morning, and I thought this was a good time to do it. And then a couple hours later, I thought, I don't feel well. So I'm just curious, from a Peachtree Road Race perspective, what can you share with the members of what they need to be on the lookout for? Because it can creep up on you before you even realize it. And how do we keep ourselves safe if we're continuing to do a lot of outdoor activities? And I do mow my grass. I know some of you are going, she was mowing the grass.
That's what I was gonna ask, if it was an electric mower or a gas-powered mower.
It is an electric mower, yes, but not self-propelled.
So the first thing that comes to mind is acclimatizing to the conditions that you are going to be outside in at any given point. So we find at the Peachtree, for example, that we have better years as measured by the number of medical contacts when it is hotter in June than when it is cooler in June, because as people are preparing for it, they've been outside, so they are ready for it. So that's one. Two, heat exhaustion comes before heat stroke. So there are some clear signs that you can see, whether you are running in the Peachtree or you were just mowing your lawn, that you should be aware of. When you stop sweating, when you start to get dizzy. There's a significant difference in our wet bulb readings
Can you explain wet bulb?
So I'll make
Go
sure
for it.
I do this
Go.
right.
You got this.
It's a combination of heat and humidity combined, which speak to how that heat is impacting you and how your sweat is evaporating and so forth. So it can be a dry heat in Arizona, 110 degrees, and it could be 79 degrees here, but it's impacting you in a much more severe way here on the morning of the 4th of July.
Okay. Any burning questions from the audience before we, Randall?
Just have a quick question. Guys, this was great, very informative. One of the things that makes sense to me is looking for the things that have the greatest impact on greenhouse effect, right? Like methane, like hydrofluorocarbons. Did Montreal with CFCs. It's like, what do you think is going to happen with hydrofluorocarbons and or methane? Because if you take a little bit of those guys out, you do more good than almost anything else you can do in the short term.
So the question for those of you who might not have been able to hear was about hydrofluorocarbons and methane, two of the largest contributors, and is there a chance that they could be taken out?
On the methane issue, when we think about reducing our consumption of meat, that's going to be something that would be critical there and could really help us to reduce those levels. And so when you talk about things on the short term, that's something that we can, for sure impact. I mean, it takes commitment to do that. But that's something that can happen. More for a longer term, we've still got to think about, I think, about carbon dioxide emissions as well. Because when we look at those trends in terms of, the global temperatures that we're seeing now, they're so closely associated with increases in CO2 in our atmosphere.
Yeah, the bill that just got passed is going to do a lot to look at methane in particular from our energy production side, largely from waste, vampire methane that's leaving from the wells and or the transmission lines themselves when they have to do work on them with very little regulation from my very limited understanding on the energy sector. To do that, you have to get rid of all of the gas that's in that line, and so it's vented and it's just goodbye into the atmosphere. It's clear we don't see it, but it does have an immediate impact. Methane is a really big short-term problem for temperatures, and if you want to flatten that curve of rising temperatures quickly, you look at methane. And if you want to flatten that curve for a long time, you look at CO2. And you have to do both. It's a yes and problem again. You really have to do both. The CFCs to HFCs was one of those classic examples of a unintended consequence. All right, we were ruining the turtle shells and the ozone hole, and so we switched our coolant into this other product, which worked really well and fixed those issues, except it's a super powerful greenhouse gas. Whoops. And so there's already a new coolant, right? The next one down the line has been made already and is transitioning into, you can look for it if you're buying a new refrigerator or you're buying a new air conditioner. You can already see that name of the product. Please don't ask me, I don't remember what it's called. But it exists already, and that's going to take over as the standard, and we hope, I guess, that there's not an unintended consequence from that one. But I think that one's just going to take time as people switch over their refrigerators, as people change over their air conditioners. That's going to naturally fix and change itself. So I think that maybe answers both of those.
So please join me in thanking Jennifer Dorian and our great panel for the discussion today. And we have coming up, what is our next speaker, Jennifer? Jill Savitt from the National Center for Civil and Human Rights will be our next speaker, so we hope to see you next week.